Hello. It's a little warm in here, but I'm in a sweatshirt, so that's on me. If you can't hear me very well, let me know. Hi, Ruben. Um, I'm seeing you all. I'm also on IG at the same time. So if you follow me on IG, you can see me, but you're going to see me from a kind of a strange angle. And let me know if you cannot hear what I'm saying. So I'll wait just a moment to get started. It looks like you can. I'm not hearing any complaints so far. So today I'm talking because it's the 56th anniversary of the VRA passing into law in the United States. Me personally, it's the most important piece of legislation to strengthen our democracy since the Reconstruction amendments, 13th, 14th, and 15th, right? If someone asked me, Maya, what are your favorite amendments, laws, it would be 13th, 14th, 15th, VRA. Then there's a ton, other than that. But the Voting Rights Act is really what gets us to a place closer to a place of equal participation and equal say in our laws and equal say in policies and equal say and in wealth redistribution or distribution or healthcare or environmental laws. And I've said this many times and I'll say it again. Everything that we care about, every single thing that we care about is attached to our being able to access the ballot box. So the VRA and its passage only 56 years ago is some of the most crucial legislation in the entire United States. Of course, we know that since 2013, that it has been rolled back, eroded, or as my friend here, I always have him ready to go. As John Lewis said, the SCOTUS put a dagger into the heart of the Voting Rights Act in 2013 when they gutted it. I think a lot of people still don't understand what is meant by that, what is meant by gutting the Voting Rights Act. I'm going to get into that. But first, before I get into the VRA, I want to kind of talk about the current state of voting in the United States right now. And why we I'm a Democrat, why we as Democrats, I believe, need to figure out new ways, better ways of discussing voting rights, the importance of it, and how we need to be attaching it to policy, attaching it to legislation, attaching it to how we're going to increase wages and have better health care and all these things. I think that sometimes Democrats have a hard time wrapping their heads around it. Let me distinguish this. I feel like a lot of Black Democrats know, and a lot of Latino Democrats know, and Native Democrats know how much voting rights affects our daily life. Being denied them affects our daily life. So I think some of the white Democrats need to get better about messaging and being passionate about why being denied voting rights is harming us as a democracy, and it's harming us in policies that we're not able to change if we don't access the ballot box. Republicans, and I'm going to distinguish this, elected Republicans very much understand that disenfranchising us, suppressing our vote, means that we don't have a say in this democracy, in our policy, in our economics, in our environment, in our education, in everything. They know this. Okay? So we need Democrats to get better, and we need to be a hive mind in how we discuss voting rights. Because when you really get into voting rights and the disenfranchisement, when you really get into the history of it, it is grotesque, it is demeaning, it is painful, it's enraging, all of that. And I think that Democrats need to show that level of passion of why we need to fight for voting rights. By the way, elected Republicans are disenfranchising a lot of their own people as well. But I know that when they're looking over their numbers, they're like, well, we can disenfranchise this amount of seniors, this amount of poor whites, and we'll still be okay. We can still get over the barrel. And Republicans are depending on voter suppression working throughout the United States because a lot of them run state legislatures. They're the ones that are making these laws, voter suppressive laws at the state level. And they know exactly how many people it picks off. So let's get into this really fast about what the current state of voting is. And then I'm going to work backwards and then I'm going to work forwards. Okay. Right now in the United States, we have 240 eligible voters in the United States. That's VEP. That's how it's discussed. And by the way, if you're joining me on IG and I'm looking down, it's because I'm live down here. So voting eligible people in the United States, that's everyone who is eligible to vote. That's 240 million people are eligible to vote in the United States. This last election in 2020, we had a record turnout, but it was still only 62% of those eligible voters voted, which means 38% of the United States did not participate in our elections during the presidential election, during this critical time, did not participate in our election, okay? So this is a problem here. Why do we have such low turnout? We can say, yay, 62%, but also realize, well, a third of our country is not participating. This is a crisis, right? So we need to look at why some of our eligible voters are not participating. And when we're not all participating, that means we don't have a fully enfranchised society. And this is why this is a problem. If we don't have a fully enfranchised society, we cannot have better laws. We cannot have better policy. So these are some of the reasons why people do not participate in our elections. There's lots of reasons. Let me start with incarceration. Incarceration, when somebody becomes an incarcerated person, a lot of them lose their right to vote. But then when they re-enter society, they're supposed to get their civil rights back. And we've seen that has not been the case, right? And there is some people that say that people who are in jail or incarcerated should still have the right to vote. I'm actually one of those people that believes that. And I'm going to tell you why. Because we have a lot of laws that are formed in our United States that are harming people and disenfranchising people, that are putting them into jail for different reasons, of poverty, of drug usage, things like this, petty crimes for survival. And those laws are affecting their life. That's why they're incarcerated. If they get to vote and say, listen, I believe that I shouldn't be in jail for weed, they should have the right to vote, okay? Then there's the other argument too, as soon as they get out of and re-enter in society, that they should get their voting rights back automatically. I also believe that you should automatically get your right to vote the second that you are re-entering society. And we saw what happened in Florida. We saw in Florida that citizens overwhelmingly said, yeah, I agree with that. Republicans agreed with that. Democrats agreed with that. But Ron DeSantis and Rick Scott and the Republicans of Florida, who are, I'm just going to say it, they're white supremacists. They are. I'm just going to say it. They are. They were like, no, we do not want people that are re-entering to society get their votes back. Why? Because they know statistically that a lot of people that are re-entering society, some of them are Democrats, and they don't want them to be on the voting rolls, right? So we know that incarceration and people that are re-entering society are being disenfranchised still, okay? Then we have polling locations. We know that when the Voting Rights Act was gutted in 2013, that right away polling closures happened. The second that the Supreme Court said in 2013, we've got a black president now, racism is over. We don't need to look at states that had formerly disenfranchised Black people. We don't need to oversee them anymore, right? That's kind of what Chief Justice Roberts said. And of course, our Bader Ginsburg disagreed with that. RIP. So we know that polling locations closed down right as soon as Voting Rights Act was gutted in 2013. And we know that if you move polling locations outside of a certain accessibility distance, that it suppresses the vote. There's studies that say that if you move it out of a certain line, like past 5 miles or something, it tends to make people go, well, I'm not going to go make it. Obviously, it hurts the disability community. It hurts seniors as well. So poll accessibility is a problem. Polling closures is a problem. A lot of states will say, well, it costs extra money. It's a really terrible excuse. It's a really terrible excuse to give. They always find money for other things. They can find money for polling. So polling locations is one of the reasons why there's polling closures is one of the reasons why. Then we have language minorities in the United States. Even though there is provisions to protect language minorities in the United States, and there has been since the early 70s, you have to have at least 10,000 people speaking a certain language in order for that to be printed. But you have some people in the United States, like in New York, we have over 200 languages spoken in New York. It might even be 300, right? And some of those people do not have their language in voting materials. I believe that everyone that needs the materials should have it in the language of which they need to vote. And that's also something that we can do now with technology much easier. So this is another way of disenfranchising people, is not having voting materials in the language that is their first language, okay? There's a lack of voter outreach. Bernard L. Fraga talks about this in his book, The Turnout Gap. This is something that Democrats really need to invest in, right? They need to invest in the fact that voters, there needs to be voter education outreach, but there needs to be a way of kind of wooing voters. I'm not going to lie. We have to go out and tell voters, listen, your voice is valuable. We want you to participate in society. We understand that you feel that nothing has changed. And by the way, when I go around my district, District 12, and I'm talking to people, and I will say it has been mostly older Black men that have told me, Maya, in my life, things have not really changed. I'm still being treated the same. I'm still making the same crappy payment I was making 2-3 decades ago. I'm still being discriminated against. Why should I participate in this, right? These are all valid things, someone is saying. Why should I participate if nothing is changing for me, right? Like, for example, in my district, and one of the reasons why I'm running in my district is the same people that were experiencing poverty 30 years ago when Representative Maloney was running and first came into office are still those experiencing poverty. A person said to me, Maya, well, poverty's gone down in your district, actually. No, it hasn't. No, it hasn't. People have just moved out of the district because they can't afford to live here anymore. And richer people have moved in. So it looks like, oh, look, your district is doing better. No, it's not. And I know this because of the conversations that I've been having with people for years in our district. Same level of job pay, no mobility upwards, still dealing with the housing crisis. And all of this is attached to voting rights, okay? All of this is attached to voting rights. So we have to recognize that this is a thing that we should be messaging. As Democrats, we should be messaging to our base and saying, listen, I really do understand things aren't changing for you, but I'm someone that sees that. I'm someone that experiences that. And by the way, that's why people like me have to run for office. I understand poverty intimately, right? And I can see, I don't even think that we should have on television, and I'm going to get back to voting. I don't think that we should have a stock market index every day. I think we should have a poverty index on television every day. And every day it should say, this is how many people that are still dealing with poverty. This is how many children are still dealing with poverty every day. That to me is a marker of whether we're a successful country or not. And we know that we're not. So that is all attached to voting rights. And that's something that Democrats need to passionately explain to their base, to the media. And by the way, that's an issue too. The media does not intimately understand voting rights, voting obstacles. They understand it in theory, but they don't really understand it, right? So this is something that we as Democrats, as politicians, as civil servants, we have to be explaining to the media why this is such a crisis, okay? Another issue that we're dealing with is obviously gerrymandering. We're dealing with racial gerrymandering and partisan gerrymandering. Gerrymandering, Democrats do gerrymandering, Republicans do gerrymandering. We should have fair maps. There should be an independent committee that does it. To me, I understand Democrats saying, listen, Republicans do it, we're going to do it too. I understand that. But we really need to move to a system where it's a fair map system, because what we have right now is completely unfair. And I know a lot of people got mad because apparently Joe Biden had said on a phone call that, don't worry, we can out-organize voter suppression. You can't out-organize partisan gerrymandering or racial gerrymandering. It's not a thing. It doesn't happen. Okay. And by the way, his team said, he didn't say that. So he said, right? Another thing that's an issue is voter ID. We've had studies that said that with voter ID issues that, well, it doesn't tend to disenfranchise as many people as we thought. If you're disenfranchising one person from voter ID, that is one too many. Okay? So we have to stop saying, well, it was only 3.4% that were disenfranchised by getting a voter ID. When I get interviewed on the news about voter ID issues, they always ask me the same thing. I don't understand what the big deal is. Why is it so hard to get a voter ID, right? Okay, first of all, this is interesting to me because this is people that have clearly never experienced poverty. Even in New York, I've experienced poverty. There was a time during the recession, I drank a gallon of milk over the course of 3 days. I had literally no money, right? And I finally was like, okay, I have to sign up for an EBT card. And I remember I went and signed up for it, and I was walking back home, and there was $2 that were on the ground that I found. And I was like, oh my God. And I went into McDonald's, and I got 2 things in a dollar bill. That's poverty, right? People experience that exact type of poverty every single day. Every single day. Do you know how much licenses cost? They cost about $50 to $60 or $75 depending on where you are. That's an exorbitant expense, one. Two, if you're an older person in America and you were born in a rural area, you may not have the documents needed to get your voter ID. You may not have the documents for your birth certificate. You may not have other IDs that are to get your driver's license, right? And there are organizations that help with that, but it's tough. So it's disenfranchising people in rural areas, usually older people. And obviously it can disenfranchise the trans community if gender is an issue on their driver's license, things like that. I mean, this is a disenfranchising thing. And by the way, voter ID hasn't always been a part of our electoral process. For many years, that's not how it worked at all. And I think people need to recognize that. I think people need to understand that voter ID is a newer way that elected Republicans saw as a way to chip away at the vote. Okay. And so I want people to understand that. And then, by the way, they knew that it would be an issue because they did another thing. Elected Republicans also started closing down DMVs in certain areas. Yes, this is all true. You can Google it. And they also shortened DMV hours. So not only did they institute a voter ID, but they're like, you can only get a voter ID every 4th Tuesday of the month. Right? Disgusting. We're talking about surgical ways of getting people to not be able to access the ballot box, okay? Then we're dealing with voter purging. Voter purging was huge, obviously, in Georgia, but it was in other states as well. And a lot of elected Republicans realized that they could purge people through the rolls if they hadn't voted in the last election. They said, we gave them a chance. We sent them a postcard saying, hey, double check your voter registration or we're going to purge you. Well, guess what? What groups of people tend to move the most in our society and may not have gotten that piece of mail? It tends to be Black people and Latino people, Hispanic people, Native people. We tend to move a lot. Why? Poverty issues, looking for a better job, our housing expenses goes up. So our mail isn't always being forwarded to us. So this is an issue. This is an issue why somebody may not have gotten that piece of mail when the Republicans in office are saying, hey, we're going to purge you from the rolls. Okay. It's a very insidious thing, right? To me, I want people to vote in every single election. But to me, once you're registered, you're registered. Yes, maybe you have to update your new address and things like that, but that's not the reason you should not be purged for on the rolls. And Kemp purged hundreds of thousands of people off the rolls when Stacey Abrams was running against him. I mean, these are really disgusting, grotesque, criminal things. Okay. Some of the other things that we have, and then I want to get into the history. I'm going to go backwards, as I said. Sorry, I'm live on IG still. So we also have the obstacle of not letting us do ballot collection. Ballot collection is something where if you're in a rural area, your neighbor can pick up the ballot. It's a sealed ballot, the ballot's sealed, and then take that in and bring it to the polling location, right? So in a lot of Native communities, they live in rural areas, and so someone will go door to door, grab the ballots, and then drive them into town down long dirt roads. Okay, I'm from New Mexico. I understand long dirt roads and rural areas, and this is an important way of doing it. This is not going to contribute to voter fraud. Okay, and this helps seniors, right? If you can take your grandma or your nana's ballot and pick it up for her so she doesn't have to go into a polling location, this is a good thing, right? This is also helps in the disability community as well. Okay, so ballot collection should be allowed in all 50 states, and right now it is allowed in some states, it's not allowed in others, and you can hear it referred to by Republicans in a pejorative way. They call it ballot harvesting, right? Republicans are always trying to find elected Republicans. I want to say elected Republicans. Elected Republicans are always trying to find a way to make voting, some part of it insidious or false or without, and why? Because they're trying to attach that to Black people. They're trying to attach that to Hispanic people. They're trying to put those things and attach it to us. Okay, I want people to understand that. All right. Ballot boxes would also help. We've seen ballot boxes work in places like Washington, where they have a Republican governor. They have automatic voting. They automatically get a ballot mailed to them. They got drop boxes. It works. So it doesn't have to it's not just a Democrat thing. We know this, right? Okay. So how have Republicans been able to do this for so long, right? One of the ways that they've been able to do this for so long is through race neutral language. They've been able to do this with race neutral language. And let me say this, because of one of the main things they do is like say fraud, right? We're worried about fraud. There's nothing inherently in that that's racist by saying we're worried about fraud, right? But then they go about calling it voter integrity. We're just trying to have voter integrity. First, let me say fraud. You have more chances of being hit by lightning than voter fraud occurring in an election. Why? Because there's a $10,000 fine for falsely voting and jail time. I'm sorry, who's so motivated to try to commit voter fraud with jail time and $10,000 fraud? It's not a motivating factor for people, right? This is something that people are just not going to do. And it rarely happens. And the time that fraud has happened has mostly been either accidental, like there was a Black woman, I think it was in Texas, where she thought that she had gotten her right back to vote after being incarcerated, and she voted, and then they threw the book at her and they put her in jail, right? That's an accidental thing. Where we've had Republicans commit voter fraud purposely in North Carolina, right? And it was still only 2-3 people. See, it's a rare thing. So I'm going to get to race neutral language here in a moment. I told you I want to work backwards. So let me work backwards. Okay. I'm going to start with 2020, this last election. And all of this is to say on this day of the VRA, why it's so important. All of the things that I'm saying is relating to this day of this being the 56th anniversary of the voting rights anniversary. 2020, I said that we had a record turnout, right? Why did we have a record turnout? Part of it is because we knew that Trump was really dangerous, or a lot of us did. A lot of people didn't find that because he still got like 70 million people that voted for him. But then there was urgency on our side as well, because we recognized that he was an existential threat to us, our physical well-being, our mental well-being, and to democracy itself, right? And because of COVID, certain things were made easier to vote. And by the way, it should be easy to vote. Okay, they're not doing us a favor by making voting accessible, right? That's not doing us a favor. Okay, voting should be easy. Okay, so one of the things they did was they increased more ballot boxes, drop boxes across the United States. They made voting by mail a little bit easier in certain places. And because Trump was nervous about that, obviously he had installed DeJoy, who, ripped out sorting machines through the post office, doing everything he could to try to stymie up this process. And I think Trump would have been successful too if he had started earlier with that. We had an AG that was obviously very shady at the time too. So these were so many obstacles put in our way, but because of COVID, honestly, we were able to just make it over the hurdle. I firmly believe that if COVID hadn't struck, Trump would have been doing all of these things, but a lot of people wouldn't have noticed, and he would have sailed under. Because remember, even though Joe Biden won by about 7 million votes with the popular vote, that's not how you win the election. You don't win the election by a popular vote, right? You win it by the Electoral College. So Biden really only won this election by about 100,000 votes in 3 states. Horrifying. Horrifying. Elected Republicans know that. And this is one of the reasons why elected Republicans right now, across state legislators, are like, how do we knock off 100,000 people from the ballot so that we, 1, win midterms, and 2, that we win the White House back in 2020. That's how they're planning. That's their planning, okay? So 2020, we barely made it through. But why did we make it through? We made it through because people like Black Voters Matter, and Fair Fight, and all of these organizers on the ground really went door to door, did voter education. I did voter education. It took a village, right, to really make sure that we all made it to the ballot box. It really took it. And that's why it's going to be tougher in 2020, okay? And then I'm going to, like I said, I'm going to work backwards. Let me go back to 2016. 2016, the news didn't understand what happened in 2016. The media really didn't understand it. The general public really didn't understand it. Even with the Mueller report coming out, I still feel like the news and the media and the general public didn't really understand what happened. Why did Hillary Clinton lose, right? Because in 2016, about 54% of our country voted, eligible voters voted. That's about a 10% drop from what voted in 2020. But people need to understand this, and I want to make this crystal clear, okay? 2016 was the first presidential election that we had since the passage of the 1965 Voting Rights Act being gutted in 2013. That is why we lost. The protections of the VRA were not in place during the 2016 election. Now, I do think that Hillary's team and the DNC and the DCCC and the DSCC, everybody, I think they could have done a better job of educating the public and saying, listen, we don't have the protections of the Voting Act. And I think that they could have done a better point about educating the media. Listen, our states are not being protected now by the Voting Rights Act, okay? So that is one of the main reasons why Hillary Clinton lost in 2016. People want to say, well, we didn't like her as a candidate, or we didn't do this. Those might have played small, minute aspects in it, but really during 2016 is we were dealing with the fact that we didn't have the protections of the VRA, and we were dealing with an insurmountable amount of disinformation. Disinformation that was flying through social media, flying through the media. And it was hard to overcome that, right? One of the reasons why we need voting rights is also so we can change how social media is distributing this type of information, right? Disinformation is incredibly dangerous to the voting process. It is absolutely harmful. It's harmful for our well-being. It's harmful for it's harmful for all of us, because disinformation is still going to be a part of 2022 midterms and 2024, our next presidential election. Disinformation is part of this insidious nature of what we're dealing with voting rights. It's one of the obstacles, right? Obstacles, gerrymandering, dealing with the fact that we have polling locations closures and disinformation. It's this massive thing that we're dealing with, right? So we need to change how social media is handling and dealing with voter disinformation. Right when Trump was taken off of social media, disinformation plummeted, right? And I know some people were like, I think this is bad. I don't think that we should be preventing people from saying what they need to say, banning them. That's a sense of that's censorship. I'm like, it's not really censorship because Trump, honestly, Trump could burp and the media is going to run to cover it, right? So Trump, that's not a thing. Trump is not being censored because he's not on a social media, right? He still has access to the news. He still has access to a microphone. But the thing is, on social media, it just runs through so quickly. So this is a problem. So 2016, this is what we are dealing with, okay? Now I'm going to move all the way back. I'm going to move back to why are we continuously dealing with voter suppression issues? Why are we still dealing with all of these insurmountably seeming issues? Why are we not able to access the ballot box? Why are we still having problems with this? And to me, it's because it's never changed, right? There's two things. We can go back to 1865, when slavery in that form, chattel slavery, became illegal, right? And then we have the 14th Amendment, equal protection, and then we have 15th with you can't discriminate against people for voting. They're black, they're men, right? Because women couldn't vote at that point. And you start having Reconstruction happening. And you start having black men coming into power. And you start seeing, wow, they're really good at their job, right? They're helping with public education. Black people are starting to create wealth at that point. And white resentment kicked in like that. White resentment kicks in right within the first 10 years of that time. And so right away, people start figuring out, like, how do we disenfranchise black people from this, right? It was that there's groups of white people that there were some white people that were like, this is good, we feel good about this. And there was groups of white people that said, we don't like this. That they only see black people in servitude way, in a chattel slavery way. They do not want to see black people with power. That has always been a part of this country and the function of this country. And we have to admit that. We know that. I know that, right? I'm a black Latina woman. I know that that's a function of this country. But a lot of people don't want to say it that bluntly. That there are people from that are still believing the narrative of 1865 that black people should have never come into power. They don't want black people to come in power. They don't want Native people to come in power. They don't want Asian Americans to be in power. They don't want Latinos to be in power. That has never left this. And how did we know that? That's not me just kind of guessing that. This is here. Let's look at the 1890 Mississippi Plan. 1890 Mississippi Plan, okay? 1890 Mississippi Plan is where we start getting a lot of the narratives of how conservative white men who are in office, how they're like, you know what, we're over black people having power. We're over it. We don't want it anymore. We're going to figure out a way to disenfranchise black people. We don't want them to have access. We don't want us to be in politics and power or policy. They want to factor us out of politics. They want to. These are white men during that time that wanted to factor us out of power, out of politics, out of policy. They don't want it. They don't want us there. Okay? So the Mississippi Plan basically comes up with the template that Republicans are still using now. A lot of people say, oh, well, we think that Jim Crow is the template. Sure, that's part of the template, but that's also part of the 1890 Mississippi Plan, which is we're going to have literacy tests. One of the tests was like, guess how many bubbles there are on soaps. Like when you lather soap, how many bubbles are in that? I mean, impossible things. Literary tests to me are a really insidious aspect of the Mississippi Plan. And I'll tell you why. Because it was at this time where I would say Republicans, but at this point they're Southern Democrats, which become Republicans. They were like, okay, we're going to do the literacy tests, but what happens if we have some black people passing these impossible literacy tests that were made to flunk? No one can pass them. We need to defund schools. This is how we start to make sure that black people do not ever pass literacy tests. So it was around this time they were like, we're not going to fund public education for black people. My grandfather Willie Sr., Willie Long Sr., he was victim of that. Him and my grandmother on my father's side was not allowed to go to school past fifth grade. Where was my family enslaved? Mississippi, the Delta. Okay, that's where my kin are from. That's where my ancestors are from. Okay, and they made it illegal for them to get education past fifth grade, and this is part just to disenfranchise them from voting. I mean, how messed up is that, right? This is one of the reasons. And this is where I need Democrats to start connecting the dots. Why are we having a disinvestment from education? Why are we having a disinvestment from healthcare? This is why when I'm talking about policy, and this is why I don't talk about policy in a way that's like class issue, right? The way like Justice Dems and Bernie and all of them, they usually talk about class. Like they talk about class. That's fine. Class is part of the conversation. But to me, race and gender are the central aspect of why we are disenfranchising people from the ballot box. This is why we're doing it. This is why we're not going to pay for education. We don't want them educated, right? We don't want them to do like with healthcare issues. Conservative elected Republicans know that Black people deal with different types of health issues. Why? Not because of our genetics or our makeup, because we're dealing with discrimination. And discrimination wears down the body because it hurts our minds. It is painful, right? So maybe if we have access to good health care, we can take care of ourselves. Republicans are like, absolutely not. Defund, make sure that there is no health care. This is all attached to voting. Do you see? I want people to understand that. Okay? If we have access to the ballot box, right? This is why Martin Luther King said, give us the ballot box. Give us the ballot box. Because if we have access to the ballot box and we are showing up, and by the way, Black women, we know this. We vote. We're there. Okay? We know this. We're like, we know that our wage, our crappy wage, that stays the same year after year after year. You know, this is why. Okay? So this is why the Mississippi plan was like, we're going to put this in place. And they were very explicit about it. They were very explicit about why they were keeping Black people, systematically blocking Black people, Indigenous people, Latino people, Hispanic people, Asian people. This is why they were systematically keeping us away from the ballot box, is because they were saying, we don't want you to access power. They don't want us to access it ever. That's what's happening. That's what's happening in Florida with DeSantis. That's what's happening in a couple of state legislatures. They don't necessarily want to say it that explicitly, right? Because then it would be kind of illegal. But that is why this is happening. They want to systematically block us, disenfranchise us from this. Okay? They are determined. They are determined. Elected Republicans are determined to keep us away from power. They don't want us to have a say in our healthcare, in our environment, in our wages, in our education. And that only changes at the ballot box. Okay? So the idea of voter integrity, and when you hear Republicans say that you need to know that that's a dog whistle when they say voter integrity, okay? Voter integrity comes from the 1890 Mississippi Plan, okay? Because that was a way for them to use race-neutral language to disenfranchise Black people. We just want, and I'm Southern, so I can kind of say this, we just want integrity in our elections, right? We just want integrity in our elections. That means they feel that if Black people have access to the ballot box, that there is a lack of integrity there. Do you understand that? They are attaching integrity with white people and illegitimacy with Black people. Do you understand? And we need the Democratic Party to be able to message that way. I'm not a risk-averse candidate, as you can see, right? I'm not a risk-averse candidate. I am happy to say, listen, let me tell you the truth about what they're doing. And we need to be able to speak that boldly about what is happening and why they're disenfranchising us, right? And let's face it, let's go back to Selma. Let's go back to Selma right now for a second. It took Selma. It took people watching Black people being beaten to death for Lyndon Baines Johnson to be like, okay, let's go ahead and try to push this through. And I'm happy that he did. But the second that he passed that, and then he passed the Civil Rights Act of 64 of the year before that, you still had white conservative men in office immediately trying to figure out, how do we disenfranchise Black people? The second that the 1964 Civil Rights Act went through, and right when the 1965 VRA went through, right then and there. And Democrats need to start saying, listen, we need to think long-term too, because we're in the right. We're saying we want a fully enfranchised society. And yes, that includes you racists, okay? We give you the right to vote too, but we're all voting. We're all going to have a right to vote. Democrats have a winning message. Republicans don't have the winning message there. And by the way, Republicans know that. Republicans know that they do not have a winning message on policy. This is why they're always doing stunts. Why do you think Republicans are always doing stunts? Like they went to the border and like camouflage and like we're in some weeds. Like, oh, look, you know. This is why they do stunts, because they have no good policy, right? Joe Biden's about to try to pass his infrastructure job bill. This is a great piece of policy. And Republicans are like, how do we say no to this? Because it's a good piece of policy. It will help them out, right? Republicans know that they don't have that. So the only thing that Republicans have is voter disenfranchisement. That is the only thing that Republicans have at this point, is disinformation, voter disenfranchisement. And this is all fueled by bigotry and not wanting to share power, let go of power, right? And we have to recognize this. So this goes back down to 1865. One of the things that Dr. King said, and I believe he did a speech in 1957, and it was "Give us the ballot." 1957, right? Part of the reasons I get so passionate about voting rights is because of how long people fought to get us the ballot. It's painful. And I don't blame younger people for maybe not understanding that, or older people. By the way, there's no ageism here, right? Because there are older people that are like, I don't care if I vote. And you have younger people going, I don't know if I don't know what's going to change. So voting is an issue across ages. No ageism there. It's across the bow. But it's also hard because we're separated a little bit from a generation that was spending their lives. I mean, people were died to try to get us this. But a lot of people still think, and rightly so, well, they died to get us the vote, but it doesn't change anything. Right? So this is what's tough, is that we have to re-energize people on why it can change things to have access to the ballot box. And this is also why, to me, when I'm talking about policy and I'm always attaching it to voting rights, is because I tell people, listen, right now, there was a scary story about the Gulf Stream today. Like the Gulf Stream is breaking up, We've been having fires in the Amazonia. We've been having flooding in Germany. We're clearly in the middle of a climate crisis, and we have been for a while. That is all attached to voting rights, right? So if we want to think long term, we have to think like, okay, we want to pass really strong environmental legislation, right? For example, the way I think of environmental legislation, I think that we should skip over to the Red Deal, which is a native plan for climate change, and part of that is giving land back. Is part of its decolonization. But at the same time, I want you to understand that people that are most affected by climate issues in America are usually Black people that are dealing with environmental racism, and Native people that are dealing with climate issues in rural areas, right? So I believe that Black people and Native people, they must lead the discussion for environmental rights. I firmly believe this. Latino people as well, right? And so to me, I when I'm talking about environmental issues, I'm also talking about the fact these people that are being harmed the most by environmental issues are the ones that are not, coincidentally, not able to access the ballot box. Do you see how that works? I really want people to get that. These people, these people are the ones that are not getting paid very well. There's no social mobility, and they're the ones being disenfranchised from the ballot box. See, that's how that works together. And who intimately knew that was Martin Luther King and Medgar Evers and Shirley Chisholm and like a host of civil rights leaders, for over 100 years. They intimately knew that. They were like, our lives are not going to change unless we have access to the ballot box. So one of the things I want to read is, I'm going to just read a little bit. I'm going to read a tiny bit of what Martin Luther King said here when he wrote, give us the ballot box. He said, Mr. Chairman, distinguished platform associates, fellow Americans, 3 years ago, the Supreme Court of this nation rendered in simple, eloquent, and unequivocal language a decision which will long be stenciled on the mental sheets of succeeding generations. For all men of goodwill, this May 17th decision came as a joyous daybreak to end the long night of human captivity. It came as a great beacon of light, of hope to millions of disheartened people throughout the world who dared to only dream of freedom. Unfortunately, this noble and sublime decision was not gone without opposition. This opposition has often risen to ominous proportions. Many states have risen up in open defiance. The legislative halls of the South ring loud with such words as nullification. But even more, all types of conniving methods are still being used to prevent Negroes from becoming registered voters. The denial of this sacred right is a tragic betrayal of the highest mandates of our democratic tradition. And so our most urgent request to the President of the United States and every member of Congress is to give us the right to vote. Give us the ballot. We will no longer have to worry the federal government about our basic rights. Give us the ballot, and we will no longer plead to the federal government for a passage of an anti-lynching law. Oh, still can't pass anti-lynching. We will, by the power of our vote, write the law of the statute books of the South and bring an end to the dastardly acts of the hooded perpetrators of violence. This is Martin Luther King's Give Us the Ballot. Give us the ballot, and we will transform the salient misdeeds of bloodthirsty mobs into the calculated deeds of orderly citizens. Give us the ballot, and we will fight our legislative halls with men of goodwill and send to the sacred halls of Congress men who will not sign a Southern manifesto because of their devotion to the manifesto of justice. Give us the ballot. We will place judges on the bench of the South who will do justly and love mercy, and will place at the head of the Southern states governors who will felt not only the tang of the human, but the glow of the divine. Give us the ballot, and we will quietly and nonviolently, without rancor or bitterness, implement the Supreme Court's decision of May 17th, 1954. And this juncture of our nation's history, there is an urgent need from the federal government. So far, only the judicial branch of the government has evinced this quality of leadership. If the executive and the legislative branches of the government were as concerned about the protection of our citizenship's rights as the federal court has been, then the transition from segregated to an integrated society would be indefinitely smoother. But we so look to Washington in vain for this concern. In the midst of this tragic breakdown of law and order, the executive branch of the government is all too silent. And of the desperate need for civil rights legislation. The legislative branch of the government is all too stagnant and hypocritical. The dearth of positive leadership from the federal government is not confined to one particular political party. Both political parties have betrayed cause of justice. The Democrats have betrayed it by capitulating to the prejudices and the undemocratic practices of the Southern Dixiecrats. The Republicans have betrayed it by capitulating to the blatant hypocrisy of right-wing, reactionary Northerners. These men so often have a high blood pressure of words and anemia of deeds. In the midst of these prevailing conditions, we come to Washington today to plead with the president and members of Congress to provide strong, moral, courageous leadership for a situation that cannot be permanently evaded. We come humbly to say to the men in the forefront of the government that the civil rights issue is not ephemeral, domestic issue that can be kicked about by reactionary guardians of the status quo. It is rather the eternal moral issue, which may be determine the destiny of our nation. The hour is late. The clock of destiny is ticking. We must act now before it is too late. Do you see this? These are words that are over 60 years old. We must act now. We must act now before it is too late. And to me, I'm going to go back to it in a moment. To me, that is the same words that we must have right now. We must pass For the People Act. We must pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, right? We must pass these things because the hour of need is now. We're heading into midterms without voter protections. The Supreme Court gutted it in 2013 and gutted it again this year. Section 2, Section 5, 4B, these things that were protecting us are gone, right? So we need to have these protections again. I'm going to finish reading this part of Give Us the Ballot by Martin Luther King from 1954 when he was talking about, and yes, we must pass the Emmett Till anti-lynching law. The fact that we haven't passed it is just horrendous, criminal, really, okay? The second arena in which there is a need for strong leadership is from white Northern liberals. There is a dire need today for liberalism that's truly liberal. What we are witnessing today in many Northern communities is a quasi-liberalism which is based on the principle of looking sympathetically at all sides, right? Of all sides. Wow, that has not changed, right? We have a media right now that is looking sympathetically at all sides, as if Black Lives Matter, who are just wanting to make sure our lives are safe, and those that attacked the Capitol, killing now at least 7 people because people have killed themselves at this point, that those are the same. They're not, right? So the media now is taking that place of looking at everything sympathetically as if everything is the same. These persons gain prominence and power by dissemination of false ideas and by deliberately appealing to the deepest hate responses within the human mind. It is my firm belief that the closed-minded, reactionary, recalcitrant group constitutes a numeral minority. I believe that too. I believe that the MAGA people are in a way a minority, but 70 million voted for that. So are they a minority? These persons are silent today because of fear of social, political, and economic reprisals. God grant the white moderates of the South will rise up courageously without fear and take up leadership in this tense period of time. I cannot close without stressing the urgent need for strong, courageous, intelligent leadership from the Negro community. We need leadership that is 1957, calm yet positive. This is no day for the rebel rouser, whether he be Negro or white. We must realize that we are all grappling with most weighty social problems of this nation and grappling in such a complex way that there is no place for misguided emotionalism. Okay, so he is talking about this idea of passion and talking about politics. I believe that he might have changed some of that language now as far as having this idea of passion. He wanted level-headed calmness in the way that when we will talk about the law, right? There's this idea in law that we do not approach it in a passionate way, that we talk about it in a level-headed way, a calm, collected way. And there is definitely a lot of good reason to think in that way. But at the same time, we also need people that feel passionately about the fact that right now we're dealing with so much voter suppression and voter disenfranchisement. So I'd be curious as to how MLK would say it today. So I'm going to end with a part that he said here. I realize that it will cause restless nights sometimes. It might cause loss of jobs. It will cause suffering and sacrifice. It might even cause physical death for some. But if physical death is the price that we must pay to free children from the permanent life of psychological death, we must keep going, keep moving amid every obstacle, keep moving amid every mountain of opposition. If you will do that with dignity, then the history books are written in the future. The historians will look back and say, there lived a great people. So right now, there's so much in what MLK said that is so still true in a way, right? We're still dealing with the same obstacles. And that is something that I want the media to understand and I want the public to understand. And that has been a point of this, right? Is to recognize that it really took, it really took hundreds of thousands of civil rights leaders and ordinary people to try to push us to getting the VRA passed in 1965. It took deaths to get the VRA passed. It took John Lewis getting beaten down to get the VRA passed. It should not take death for that to pass, right? It should not take our deaths to pass for the People Act. But what it's going to take is going to take passion and a clear message. It takes a clear message. Yes, someone says, and we're here carrying the torch. Absolutely, we are. To me, when John Lewis died, I cried, but I also recognize that I'm like, Maya, you are one of the people that must continue this work. And it makes me emotional. It makes me emotional that we do have to fight passionately for voting rights because we're fighting for all of us. We're fighting for ourselves. I'm fighting for myself too. You know what I'm saying? Like people say, when people think about leadership, and I'm going to end with this, and I'm going to end with this. When people talk about leadership, right? People are talking about me, Maya, you're running for office, you're moving into, this leadership role. Listen, you're going to be fighting for others. Listen, I'm fighting for myself too, right? Part of when we're fighting for voting rights, when we're fighting for equity, when we're fighting for, God, to live our lives in the way that makes us feel good about ourselves, right? When we feel self-actualized, that's fighting for ourselves. And that's important. We must fight for ourselves in that way too. And that is how we're fighting beside each other. That's how we do that. Right? Listen to me. I'm going to tell you this. You're going to see my financial disclosure form because part of when you run for office, you sign a financial disclosure form and it tells you how much you owe and how much you own, right? So people will see, well, I don't have any money. Right? That's true. I don't have money. Me and my husband, we live in a 300 square foot apartment. I owe six figures in student loans. And I only have one credit card that's I owe money on that. That's it. That's my debt. But the student loans is a lot. And why do I owe so much in student loans? Because at 18, I signed my life away I either had a choice, don't go to college or take out a bunch of student loans. So I took out a bunch of student loans, right? And I will tell you right now that a lot of Black women like myself owe a lot of student loans. And why do we owe so much? Because we're making less. We're making less than cis men, white men, right? We're making less than them. Discrimination at jobs. I've I've had a discrimination issue at a job. I had a hair discrimination thing at a job where they were telling me I needed to tame my hair down. And I was always in a place where I was not financially advancing into jobs. It doesn't matter that I have this fancy degree behind me, my master's degree. It doesn't matter. I still was not advancing in jobs. You know what? That's so many Black women. That's so many Latino people, right? And so part of me running for office is also fighting for myself, because if I am somebody that still can't make it past a certain yearly salary, there's hundreds of thousands, if not millions of us that are dealing with that. And I want to change that, right? And I can only change that by, one, you electing me, and two, by fighting for voting rights, okay? And, you know, one of the things that I'm also really sick of, and one of the reasons why I'm running, is because for me personally, the person that I'm running against right now, I was going to meet with some people in Queens, and Maloney was there too, and she handed them 2 certificates for the work that they did to help with food insecurity in the area of Queens. And she gave them 2 certificates. And I gotta be honest, it pissed me off. I'm so tired of politicians being like, hey, thank you for doing our work for us. Thank you for taking care of food insecurity issues. Here's a certificate for you. Good job. They don't need a certificate. They need money. Do you know what I'm saying? We don't need certificates. We need money. We need to make sure that our organizations are funded so that we can do the work of the community. All right? We don't need little medals. We don't need statues. We need our organizations to be fully funded. We need our housing to be fully funded. We need healthcare to be fully funded. We need education to be fully funded. We don't need to be racked up with a bunch of debt when we clearly see that other people are getting bailed out all the time, right? To me, it's like, okay, we were talking about the eviction moratorium that was happening here. In New York, we have until the end of this month. And now on the federal level, that might get extended. And people are like, oh, we need to expand the moratorium. Of course we do. But you know what else we need to do? Just give people money to make sure that the bills are caught up. We have it. We pay into it. It's our taxes. And I know this because I ended up paying a lot of taxes, even though I'm like, I still didn't make much, but I still owed a lot, right? Just get the money. This is the main obstacle. The main obstacle that most people deal with is financial, right? If you are disenfranchising people financially, they can't have access to healthcare. They can't get their teeth fixed. They can't go to the college that they want to. They can't get their car fixed, which affects them going to work. They can't take, on and on and on. Money, right? And to me, I see that my leadership in my area does not fundamentally understand that. She does not fundamentally understand poverty. If she did fundamentally understand poverty, she wouldn't be like, we need to get these new statues built. Or she said, and one thing that I had a huge problem with, she said, we need to protect food banks because they're the first line of defense. They're the first line of defense for us when it comes to poverty. No, it's not. Food banks are the last defense. That means wages failed. That means jobs failed. That means housing failed. That's when when the levees break. That is why food banks come into play. And by the way, there's a lot of mutual fund groups popping up. I'm wearing a mutual fund shirt right now. It's from Brooklyn. I like them. I support them. Mutual aid has been around for a very long time, right? Mutual aid has been around for a long time. One of the reasons why mutual aid was around was Black Panthers were really the ones that kind of helmed mutual aid. It's because why? The government didn't care about Black communities, and they certainly didn't care about Black children, and they didn't even understand Black children. Like the Moynihan report was like this weird report, racist report that was like, Black women are the reason why families are failing. It's like disgustingly racist. And that was like a white liberal that was like trying to understand racism and like was awful. And so we still see that we have people that are leadership that are in Congress right now that don't understand poverty. They don't understand racism. They don't understand discrimination, right? And so to me, I'm sorry, that needs to be part of the job description. The job description for Congress now has to be, you have to fundamentally understand poverty. And I do. Because I've been poor. I've lived under the poverty line the vast majority of my life. And I gotta be honest, was one of the first times that I didn't live on the poverty line is because I fell in love with a man, a white man. And it was the first time like I had access to some of the generational wealth that his family had, right? It's not a lot, but it was some, right? That's gross. Why? Why didn't I have access to that? Why do all our other groups have that? I mean, that's so frustrating, isn't it? Right? It's awful. So we're seeing that these things are not changing for people, that they are fundamentally not changing for people. So so people will say, right, Maya, why are you qualified to run for Congress? People are going to give me that question. They're going to ask me that question, right? First of all, there are only 3 constitutional qualifications for somebody running for the House. You have to be over 25 years old. You have to be an American citizen for at least 7 years. And you have to live in the state of which you're running. Those are the only qualifications for running for Congress. Should there be more? Yeah, absolutely. And the sense of this, listen, I think that ordinary people with every type of education should be able to go into Congress right away. Right? For too long, the only people that were ever going into Congress had like big Ivy League educations. All of their family served in Congress. They looked at it as a way of helping their families, corporations out, doing all this other stuff. That's how Congress was. Congress was for them and not for us. Well, now Congress is for us. Okay. So to me, I have every right to run for Congress, and I have every right to challenge an incumbent that I think is out of date and out of step with where we need to be now. Right. That's no knock against me saying, that she's a bad person. I of course don't think that Carolyn Maloney is a bad person. I've met her, but I also think that she's out of step and out of touch with the vast majority of the constituents that live in her area. And by the way, a lot of the constituents in this area do not know her. Right? I know that sounds strange, right? But look at the voting track record of how many people vote for her on average, right? So we know in the last election, and then I'm going to end this talk after this, okay? I'm sorry. But, 16, 20,000 people vote for her in primaries, maybe 45,000 at the most. Our districts are about 717,000 people. So I meet a lot of people every day. I go out and talk to people every day in my district. Just kind of tell them I'm running, have conversations with them. And I'm like, how do you feel about your current representation? And I'll tell you, a lot of people say, I don't know who it is. Okay. So, but this is also why a lot of people want to see a change in leadership too, because they were like, this is the first time I'm talking to somebody that's running for office. This is the first time. Seriously. Okay. So I'm excited. I'm excited about running for office. I'm excited to fight for voting rights. I'm going to fight for voting rights every single day, all the time, until not only do we have voting rights at the federal level, but I want to inspire and push for making sure that we have voting rights at the state level. Voting rights should be in every state. In New York State, we have a Voting Rights Act right now that Senator Myrie has put in. It's the John Lewis Voting Rights Act of New York State. And I testified on behalf of that Voting Rights Act, okay? Because we should have it at the state level, not just federal oversight, state oversight, right? Every state should have that. We should be able to walk up the street, go into our polling place, sign the ledger, cast our vote, boom, go home and ready to go. We should be able to register to vote online, right? Because to me, even some places are allowing that, but some places you've got to print it out, sign it, put a stamp on it, and mail it in. And that to me is also an expense and another hurdle. And one of the things I want to also say is, let me say this. I will tell you that all these voter suppression laws, a lot of people outside of maybe Joe Biden have said, maybe we can out-organize again in midterms. I'm going to tell you why it's hard to do that. Many studies have shown that just doing voter suppression, putting voter suppression laws on the books already makes people go, you know what? I'm not going to vote. It's too many obstacles. I don't even want to try it. So just putting voter suppression, disenfranchising voters, that already deters people from voting. Okay? I want that to be clear. I want people to understand that. And so I also want to say that making it easier to vote means more people register to vote. And then voter outreach encourages more people to vote. So we know that during Reconstruction, as soon as Black men were able to vote, the voting rolls shot up with black men on it. When the Mississippi plan came in, it went down to almost nothing. When the March on Selma was happening, out of the 13,000 black people that lived in Selma that were eligible to vote, 13,000, only 300 of them were registered to vote. Do you understand? So voter suppression laws are effective in keeping us from the access to the ballot box. And this is why we have to fight to make sure that we are all eligible to vote, that we pass these voting laws. And by the way, we all need to be screaming at Sinema and Joe Manchin and saying like, what the hell? This is gross. I know you guys think that this isn't a winning issue for you, but you should be passing this. This should be done. The John Lewis Voting Rights Act right now should pass. Right now. It should be passing right now. And I know that Schumer is like, I'm going to bring it up. I'm bringing it up. That's my senator. I need Schumer to definitely do that this month. Let's get the John Lewis Voting Rights Act passed now. The reason why it's going to be harder to pass For the People Act is because For the People Act is this like delicious, beautiful piece of legislation. Oh, it's sexy. I'm not going to lie. And this is one of the reasons why Manchin and Sinema do not want to pass that law. Why? Because it exposes who their donors are, right? So For the People Act is a gorgeous, gorgeous piece of legislation, right? I'm going to tell you a couple of what it does. Modernizes voter registration, restores voting rights, protects the ballot box. It restores the Voting Rights Act and DC and the territorial voting rights. It ends gerrymandering in the way that we've done it, okay? It adds to election security. There's campaign transparency, countering foreign interference, empowering small donors and related reforms. It enforces campaign finance laws, strengthens campaign contribution limits. It has a Supreme Court's ethics reform. It expands lobbying disclosures. There's more transparency, okay? Recusal of presidential appointees, executive branch ethics reforms, congressional ethics reforms, disclosure of presidential tax returns. Wow. That is what's in For the People Act. And I'll post this later. It's from the Brennan Law Center. And you can Google this. It's Annotated Guide For the People Act 2021. It is a gorgeous, gorgeous piece of legislation. And this is why Sinema and Manchin are like, I don't want anything to do with that. Because if you find out who is funding them through, they call it dark money. I don't like that word. I got to say that. I don't like anything negative associated with dark and black. Sorry. But I'm telling you right now, this is one of the reasons they want to pass it. Sinema and Joe Manchin do not want you all to know who was donating to them. This is why they're stopping it. Because otherwise, it is a wonderful, beautiful piece of legislation. So all of us need to fight for the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. And I will tell you what the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, what it will do is it aids the DOJ, the Department of Justice, in the fact that it will stymie up what some of these states are doing with voter suppression laws. I will also tell you this. Any law that has passed already, and there has been about 18 pieces of voter suppression that have passed through state houses around the United States, that law won't go back and get rid of those. It will get rid of the ones that come after that. These ones that have already passed, lawyers like Mark Ellis and the NAACP, LDF, and Voters for Civil Rights, the ACLU, those are the ones that are going to be fighting to block those pieces of legislation right now. Because, I mean, they're still racist pieces of legislation. But the John Lewis Act, if we pass it, moving forward, it's going to help block some of that more nefarious aspects of voter suppression and voter laws. Okay, so we have to come together as Democrats, as voters, as people that care about this country. If you care about immigration rights, if you care about the financial well-being of families, if you want to pull children out of poverty, if you want to make sure the disability community has equal access to everything, to housing, to finances, if you want to make sure that Native communities are taken care of, everything, then that's all attached to voting rights. I want to leave with that. I want to make sure that people understand that everything that we care about is deeply tied to voting rights. And I really want people to understand this. When Republicans are saying that they want Republicans in office, I always make that distinction because I know Republicans that are fine with voting rights, okay? But Republicans in office are not, because it feels like it takes away from their money. I want people to understand this. When Republicans in office are saying voter integrity, they are associating voter integrity with white people. And they are associating fraud with Black, Indigenous, and Latino people, okay? I want people to be clear about that. And we have to be clear about that is what they're trying to say. They are insulting all of us. And we need to be clear in our messaging about voting rights, okay? Because they are keeping us, and as I said earlier in the discussion, this is why we can't fund our schools. This is why we can't fully fund public housing. This is why we can't get the type of health care that we want, is because they are keeping us from the ballot box, okay? So happy anniversary to the Voting Rights Act, you gorgeous piece of legislation that MLK and Medgar Evers and Fannie Lou Hamer and everybody fought for. Our fight continues. Please remember that. Yes, we're fighting for each other, but we're fighting for ourselves, okay? Please also remember that. We're fighting for ourselves. I want all of us to be self-actualized in what we're doing and how we're living our lives, right? Like, let's fight for this, right? If you care about trans rights, if you care about Native rights, if you care about education, about getting rid of debt, about doing all this stuff, then you care about voting rights. Please tell everybody that you are a voting rights advocate. You don't have to know as much about me about voting rights, right? You don't have to know much about me about voting rights, but you can call yourself a voting rights advocate right now, because if you believe in voting rights, then you're a voting rights advocate, okay? And I want every day for you all to be like, For the People Act, John Lewis Voting Rights Act, right? Okay? Love to you all. Donate to my campaign, because it's expensive. It's expensive running. And I don't have the infrastructure. I'm not a Justice Dem. Justice Dems, they have their own financial infrastructure. Because I'm challenging an incumbent, I'm not going to have the DNC infrastructure. So I have to create my own infrastructure. You all are my infrastructure, okay? So donate to my campaign. Love to you all. Every Tuesday, I do a voting rights talk at 3 p.m. Follow me on social media if you're following me now. Get that information. Join me for my voting rights talk, okay? Love to you all.